mindset that built Apple and changed the world. Most people think Steve Jobs succeeded because he was a genius. Others think he succeeded because he was lucky. Some say he was simply a great salesman. But if you study his life closely enough, you realize something strange. There were plenty of people who were smarter than Steve Jobs, plenty of engineers who knew more about computers, plenty of executives who knew more about business. Yet somehow, Steve Jobs built one of the most valuable companies in history. Why? Because Steve Jobs didn't see the world the way everyone else did. While most people accepted reality, Steve questioned it. While most people focused on what existed, Steve focused on what could exist. And that difference changed everything. This is the story of how Steve Jobs thought, and more importantly, how that way of thinking helped him build Apple, create revolutionary products, and leave a mark on history that still shapes your life today. Long before Apple, before the iPhone, before the black turtleneck and billion-dollar keynotes, there was just a kid growing up in California. A kid who never quite felt like he fit in. Steve Jobs was born in 1955 and was adopted shortly after birth. For years, he wrestled with that fact. Questions like, why was I given away? Why wasn't I wanted? Those questions stayed with him. And while many people would see that as a weakness, it became fuel, because Steve developed something that would define his entire life. A desire to prove himself, not to the world, to himself. As a child, Steve was curious about everything: electronics, machines, how things worked, how things were built. His father would spend hours teaching him practical skills, taking apart objects, fixing things, building things. But there was one lesson Steve never forgot. His father told him that even the back of a cabinet should be beautiful, even if nobody ever sees it. Think about that. Nobody sees it, nobody pays for it, nobody notices it, but you do it anyway. Because excellence isn't about recognition, it's about standards. Decades later, that exact philosophy would shape every Apple product. Steve Jobs became obsessed with perfection, not because customers demanded it, because he demanded it. Now here's where things get interesting. Most people think Steve Jobs loved technology, and he did, but technology wasn't his real obsession. People were. Human behavior, human emotion, human experience. Steve wasn't just studying computers, he was studying people. In college, he became fascinated with subjects that seemed completely unrelated to business: calligraphy, design, philosophy, literature, meditation, spirituality. At the time, none of it made sense. His friends thought he was wasting time. After all, how does studying beautiful handwriting help you build computers? The answer came years later, because Steve Jobs understood something most people miss. Innovation happens when different worlds collide. The best ideas often come from connecting things that seem unrelated. Years later, when Apple created the Macintosh, it became the first computer with beautiful typography, elegant fonts, beautiful spacing, design that felt human, and all of it came from a random calligraphy class Steve took years earlier. The lesson? Nothing you learn is ever wasted if you're curious enough. Now let's talk about the thing that made Steve Jobs different: his obsession with simplicity. People love simplicity, but very few understand how difficult it is. Complicated is easy, simple is hard. Anyone can add more features, more buttons, more options, more complexity. But removing things, that's difficult, because every removal requires understanding. Steve believed that simplicity was the ultimate sign of mastery. If you truly understood something, you could make it simple. This became one of Apple's biggest advantages. While competitors kept adding more and more features, Apple focused on removing friction. While everyone else focused on technology, Steve focused on experience. He wasn't asking, how do we build a better computer? He was asking, how should this feel for the person using it? And that question changed everything. One of the strangest things about Steve Jobs was that he didn't believe customers knew what they wanted. Now that sounds arrogant, but hear him out. Most companies ask customers what they want. Steve rarely did. Why? Because he believed people can describe their problems, but they cannot always imagine solutions that don't exist yet. Nobody asked for the iPhone, nobody demanded the iPad, nobody requested AirPods. Yet once those products existed, millions couldn't imagine life without them. Steve understood something incredibly important. The future is rarely built by surveys. It's built by vision, by seeing something before other people see it, and then having the courage to build it. But here's the part most people don't talk about. Steve Jobs wasn't easy to work with, not even close. He was intense, demanding, relentless, sometimes impossible. He pushed people harder than they thought they could go. Engineers would tell him something couldn't be done. Steve would stare back and say, "Figure it out." Designers would say it was impossible. Steve would say, "No, try again," over and over, again and again and again. People called this his reality distortion field, because somehow he convinced people to achieve things they thought were impossible. Now sometimes he pushed too hard, sometimes he was wrong, but surprisingly often, he was right. Because Steve understood a truth about human beings. Most of our limits aren't physical, they're psychological. Most people stop long before they reach their actual potential. Steve's gift was forcing people beyond that point. Then came the moment that should have ended everything, 1985. Steve Jobs gets fired from Apple, the company he created. Think about how insane that sounds. Imagine building your dream from nothing, pouring your life into it, and then being kicked out, humiliated, rejected, removed. For most people, that would have been the end. But for Steve, it became the beginning. Years later, he would say it was one of the best things that ever happened to him. Because failure stripped away certainty, it forced him to start over. And starting over gave him freedom. That's one of the most powerful lessons from Steve Jobs' life. Sometimes the thing that feels like destruction is actually construction happening in disguise. During this period, Steve started another company, Next. And he invested in a small animation studio called Pixar. At the time, almost nobody cared about Pixar, but Steve did. He believed in it. Years later, Pixar would create Toy Story, then Finding Nemo, then The Incredibles, then a long list of films that changed animation forever. Again, the pattern repeats. Steve saw value where others didn't, not because he was lucky, because he trained himself to see possibilities. Then came one of the greatest comebacks in business history. Apple was struggling, the company was losing direction, products were confusing, innovation had stalled, and Steve Jobs returned. What happened next is fascinating, because most executives would try to save the company by doing more. More products, more divisions, more projects. Steve did the opposite. He cut and cut and cut again. Entire product lines disappeared, projects vanished, teams were reorganized. Because Steve understood something most people never learn. Success isn't built by saying yes, it's built by saying no. No to distractions, no to mediocrity, no to opportunities that don't matter. Focus creates power, and Apple became powerful again. Then came 2007, a year that changed the world. Steve Jobs walked onto a stage, wearing jeans, sneakers, a black turtleneck, and introduced the iPhone. Most people didn't realize it at the time, but they were witnessing history, because the iPhone wasn't just another phone. It was the beginning of a new era, an internet device, a camera, a computer, a music player, all inside your pocket. And suddenly, the world changed. Entire industries disappeared, new industries emerged, and the smartphone became one of the most important inventions of the modern age. But if you ask me, the most important thing Steve Jobs ever taught wasn't about technology, it was about time. Near the end of his life, after being diagnosed with cancer, Steve became obsessed with the simple idea, mortality, the fact that life ends. Most people avoid thinking about death. Steve did the opposite. Because he believed death creates clarity, it forces you to focus, it reminds you that your time is limited, and if your time is limited, why waste it living someone else's life? Why waste it chasing someone else's dream? Why spend years seeking approval from people who aren't building your future? That perspective shaped every decision he made. And maybe that's the real answer to the question, how did Steve Jobs think? He thought differently because he refused to accept default settings. He questioned assumptions. He connected ideas from different worlds. He obsessed over simplicity. He focused relentlessly. He embraced failure. And above all, he remembered that life is short, very short, which meant every day mattered, every decision mattered, every opportunity mattered, because someday, time runs out. And Steve Jobs understood that better than most. That's why he moved so fast. That's why he demanded so much. That's why he built products people couldn't imagine. Because while most people were adapting to the future, Steve Jobs was trying to create it, and in many ways, He did.